This is R.C. Gorman's beautiful painting of Yellow Woman. R.C. Gorman's a great Native American painter. And this is a story, like I said, that you will not know. It comes out of Laguna Pueblo, and you're going to know it by the end. It's one of my favorite stories ever. I think I couldn't find a more perfect story for us to end our series tonight. And I'm not going to tell you why. I think it's going to become evident as we go through here. So let's begin going through here. These are the pueblos. There are 19 of them in New Mexico, mostly along the Rio Grande River. There's one in Arizona, Hopi, and then there's one in Texas as well. So they're pretty much along the river there. They are called the ancestral pueblos, the people who built these cliff dwellings, you may know or have even visited. Sometimes called the Anasazi. That is not the preferred term now, because that's a Navajo word that means enemy ancestor. So the Pueblo peoples were like, how about just calling us ancestral pueblos? You may know these are complex and multi-storied adobe villages in the pueblos, but it's that same kind of structure. Pueblo just means the town, as you probably know, and it eventually comes to mean the people who live in these towns along the Rio Grande. There are mountains there, especially with the pueblos around Albuquerque, like Laguna Pueblo. It's about 40 miles west of Albuquerque. There's a beautiful mountain there called Mount Taylor that they have a name for called Say, and it means basically the woman veiled in rain clouds. And I love that, the woman veiled in rain clouds. Very nice. In these mountains live spirits, Katsina spirits. You may have seen or have a Katsina doll. The dolls are the representations of the spirits because the spirits left. The spirits emerged from the fourth world with the Pueblo people into this, the fifth world, but they were neglected and treated badly and forgotten, and so they disappeared. And so they went up into the mountains, and they exist now as mountain spirits. They take all kinds of forms, wind, mountains, rocks, rain, whatever. The Hopi in particular are fond of these Katsina ceremonies and making the Katsina dolls, which they give to their children to remind the children of the Katsina spirits who have left. You may well see Katsina dances. If you go to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, they're absolutely marvelous. And the idea, again, is the spirits have come down to visit. They have decided to return, and so they come in and dance. Pueblos are unique in that they were able to remain on their ancestral land. They were not exiled like, say, the Cherokee or every one of the eastern tribes. They were not decimated, obliterated like many of the California tribes. And they were unique, and this may be related to that. They were unique. They were like the Aztecs in that they were able to acculturate the incoming colonial Catholicism. And it's a fascinating process. So the Spanish missionaries come and they have Mary, the Mother of God, and they're like, oh, we know her, that's the Corn Mother. And of course they learned fairly brutally that was not the Corn Mother, and you must not say that. So what happened was they took it underground and they made it secret. So whenever there was an Easter celebration or a Christmas celebration, they just adapted their ceremonies to the Christian calendar and the Christian form. And this is survival. This is how many indigenous people survive, is through adaptation. A perfect example is in 1911, a group, I believe it was the Apache mainly, formed the Native American Church. You heard about this? It's fascinating. Used peyote in place of the Eucharist. It was brilliant, right? Hey, we're a church. There's actually an interesting legal history associated with that, but we won't get into that tonight. Let's just say the Pueblos are especially adaptable. And you would have to be. If you've ever been to the Hopi Reservation, it's 3 mesas in northeastern Arizona, and you would never think human beings could live there. There's no water, apparently. It's high desert. There's there are no trees, few bushes. And yet it's the oldest continually inhabited city or village in America. So they've been there a long, long time. So I want to tell you some stories tonight, as I always do. But these stories will be a little different, if only because they come from the Pueblos. So the Pueblos and the Navajos live close together, and you're going to hear a lot about the Navajos tonight because they're adjacent and they mix. And in fact, there's a whole story about the Navajo feast day, about how some Navajos came into one of the Pueblo villages and stole some food, and the Pueblo men chased them down and said, "What are you doing?" And they're like, "We're just starving." And they're like, "Well, why didn't you ask? And we would have fed you." And so this was hundreds of years ago. And so now there is the Navajo feast day, where when a Navajo visits a Pueblo village, the Pueblo people in that village must feed him. This sounds nice. It's romantic. It is. It's lovely. It's cute. It's also brilliantly efficient, because it's better to feed your enemy than to have him attack you for food, right? This is Native American culture. Well, it's one Navajo feast day, and there's this coyote on the mesa, and you know coyote, right? Watch out for coyote. He's very tricky. He's looking over the edge of the mesa, and he's so hungry. And he sees the Navajo feast being laid out, and he's like, "Oh man, that's incredible. There are the dancers. Oh, I wish I were down there with the dancers, but I'm stuck on this mesa. Oh, the food smells wonderful. I can just it's just wafting up the mesa. Oh, how do I get down off this mesa? I want to play with the dancers. I want to see the dancers. I want to eat. I want to just be part of the feast. Oh, it's so good." So he's like, okay. Coyote always has an idea. That's one thing about coyote. And this coyote has an idea. And so he calls his cousins. "Ahoo, ahoo," he calls his cousins. They come running. And they say, "What's up, cousin?" He said, listen to the music. Look at the dancers. Smell the food." They're like, "Oh, cousin, that food smells so good. The dancers look brilliant and wonderful. And oh, I wish we could get down there, but how can we?" And he said, "I have an idea. Let's make a coyote chain." And they're like, "What's a coyote chain?" And he said, "One coyote goes down, the other grabs his tail in his mouth, and you just keep doing that, and you've got a coyote chain." Coyote is never smart. He's tricky, but he's not always smart. So they're like, "Cousin, I don't know about this. This doesn't sound so good." He's like, "No, trust me. I've thought this out. I've been up here all by myself. This is going to work. Let's make a coyote chain." So they start. You don't like that, Karen? It's not going to work? You don't think it's going to work? Okay, fair enough. Of course. Anything else you'd like to say? From 9 to 90, we have them here. Excuse me, 10. Pardon me, Kieran. Happy birthday. All right. Thank you. Got to watch what I put on my slides when I'm telling stories, right? Do you know how the disaster happened? Listen to this, Kieran. So they got the coyote chain going. They're hanging off the mesa, and one of them in the middle farts. And the one behind him says, "Ew, who farted?" And he opens his mouth to say that, and they all fall down. That's the disaster. And I'm sorry, but they die. You know coyotes die, right? We all. Let's not get into that. So they die, and it leaves a big pile of coyote bones. All right. This is Leslie Marmon Silko telling a coyote story in 1973 called Dosh. By the way, that's John A. Quick to See Smith. I love her work. If you're interested in Native American art, she's fantastic. Leslie Silko. For a poem dedicated to Simon Ortiz, who's her friend who lives on Acoma Pueblo. In the wintertime at night, we tell coyote stories and drink spinata by the stove. How Coyote got his old ratty coat, bits of old fur the sparrows stuck on him with dabs of pitch. This was after he lost his proud original one in a poker game. Anyhow, things like that are always happening to him. That's what he said anyway. And it happened to him at Laguna and Chinle and Lucachucay because Coyote got too smart for his own good. The Navajos say he won a contest once. It was to see who could sleep out in a snowstorm the longest. And Coyote waited until Chipmunk, Badger, and Skunk were all curled up under the snow. Then he uncovered himself and slept inside. And before morning, he got up and went out again and waited until the others got up before he came in to take the prize. Some white men came to Acoma and Laguna 100 years ago, and they fought over Acoma land and Laguna women. And even now, some of their descendants are howling in the hills southeast of Laguna. Coyote wanted to be governor, and he said that when he got elected, he would run the other men off the reservation and keep all the women for himself. One year, politicians got fancy at Laguna. They went door to door with hams and turkeys, and they gave them to anyone who promised to vote for them. On election day, all the people stayed home and ate turkey and laughed. The Trans-Western Pipeline vice president came to discuss right-of-way. The Lagunas let him wait all day long because he is a busy and important man. And late in the afternoon, they told him, "Come back tomorrow." They were after the picnic food that the special dancers left down below the cliff. And Dosh and his cousins hung themselves down over the cliff, holding each other's tail in their mouth, making a coyote chain until someone in the middle farted, and the guy behind him opened his mouth to say, "What stinks?" And they all went tumbling down like that. Howling and roaring, Dosh scattered white people out of bars all over Wisconsin. He bumped into them at the door until they said, "Excuse me." And the way Simon Ortiz meant it was like it was for 300 or 400 years. This is Leslie Marmon Silko. She's a poet, novelist, essayist. She wrote a number of books. The ones you might know are Storyteller. Ceremony is her most famous work, a novel. Almanac of the Dead, I've mentioned here before that I said don't read it. It's a 763-page indictment of the United States in novel form. Some of the darkest stuff I've ever read, and I love the dark stuff. She had a scholarship to law school at the University of New Mexico, spent about a semester there and said, "This is no way to get justice." Dropped out to tell stories. That's how you get justice, she thought. So she actually says she wrote Almanac of the Dead as a legal indictment, which is why it's 763 pages long. She is continuing the oral stories of the Laguna in print. We've talked about this so many times, that the stories we encounter were always oral. They were told in spoken word. They were told around campfires. They were told in the presence of each other. They were oral. They were much more dynamic and human than a story that exists in an object that's separate from you. That has distinct advantages, don't get me wrong. But the oral becomes the literate, and it changes the story, and it changes us. Leslie Silko is keeping those old stories alive, more than alive, you'll see, in print. How can she do this? That's one of the things you're going to see tonight. In Storyteller is a short story called Yellow Woman. All right? And that's the story I want to tell you tonight. And it begins like this. What whirlwind man told Kochi Ninako, Yellow Woman? I myself belong to the wind, and so it is we will travel swiftly this whole world with dust and windstorms. Whirlwind man, buffalo man, both Katsina spirits. The story begins, my thigh clung with his dampness. That's the opening line. Okay, so you know something's up. What happens is the narrator of this story is an unnamed woman who's a little lost because she's crossed the river. Be careful crossing rivers, because that's how you enter into other worlds. And and in fact, she goes down to the river to get water. She's doing a very ordinary domestic thing. And there are Yellow Woman stories throughout Pueblo mythology. She always has a water jar because she's down to the river to get water. And she always meets some kind of spirit, whirlwind man, buffalo man, something like that. And he says, come with me. And her answer is always, what will I do with my water jar? And he says, turn it upside down on the bank. Okay, there's some heavy symbolism there, right? This is the domestic life that you are leaving behind. In fact, you're turning it upside down. You're not going to need that anymore. Right? So in this short story, again, this is a short story, she wakes up on the other side of the riverbank with this man. His name ends up being Silva. And she watches the sunrise alone, goes down to get her horse, and intends on returning to her pueblo, but she can't quite find it. That's a theme that runs throughout the story. She comes back to him, can't find her way home, and she says, wake up, I'm leaving. He says, you're coming with me, remember? Where? To my place. And will I come back? Yellow Woman, he said. Who are you? Last night you guessed my name, he says, and you knew why I had come. And she says, but I only said that you were him and that I was Yellow Woman. I'm not really her. I have my own name, and I come from the pueblo on the other side of the mesa. Your name is Silva, and you're a stranger I met by the river yesterday afternoon. Watch her try to ground herself in her old life. I'm not Yellow Woman. No, I'm from that pueblo over there. And your name is Silva, like you're an ordinary guy, right? He says, what happened yesterday has nothing to do with what you will do today, Yellow Woman. I know, that's what I'm saying, she says. The old stories about the Katsina spirit and Yellow Woman, that can't mean us. Come here, he said gently. She said, the narrator in the short story says, I was wondering if Yellow Woman had known who she was, if she knew that she would become a part of the stories. Maybe she'd had another name that her husband's relatives called her, so that only the Katsina from the north and the storytellers would know her as Yellow Woman. Okay, now she's got another name. Another name means another identity. She says to him, do you know the story? What story? He says. I don't have to go, she says. What they tell in the stories was real only back then, back in time immemorial, as they say. Let's go, he says. She says, the narrator now, not talking to Silva, I walked beside him, breathing hard because he walked fast, his hand around my wrist. I had stopped trying to pull away from him because his hand felt cool, and the sun was high, drying the riverbed into alkali. I will see someone, eventually I will see someone, and then I'll be certain that he's only a man, some man from nearby, and I'll be sure that I am not Yellow Woman, because she's from the past, and I live now. I've been to school, and there are highways and pickup trucks, things that Yellow Woman never saw. They head to the north, into the mountains on horseback. I felt hungry and wondered what they were doing at home right now. My mother, my grandmother, my husband, and the baby, cooking breakfast, saying, where did she go? Maybe she was kidnapped. And Al's the husband. How perfect is that? And Al going to the tribal police with details. She went walking along the river. She turns to Silva and says, have you brought women here before? He smiled and kept chewing his food. She says, do you always use the same tricks? What tricks? He said, like he didn't understand. The story about being a Katsina from the mountains, the story about Yellow Woman. Silva was silent. His face was calm. I don't believe it, she said. Those stories couldn't happen now. No. He shook his head and said softly, but someday they will talk about us, and they will say those two lived long ago when things like that happened. She looks out over the mountain looking for her home. Can you see the pueblo? Silva asks, standing beside me. No, we're too far. Yes, you are. You're too far. From here, he says, I can see the world. He stepped out onto the edge. The Texans have their ranches over there, starting with that valley, the Concho Valley. The Mexicans run some cattle over there too. Do you ever work for them? I steal from them. She says to the reader, I started wondering about this man who could speak the Pueblo language so well, but who lived on a mountain and rustled cattle. I decided he must be a Navajo, because Pueblo men didn't do things like that. You must be a Navajo. Silva shook his head gently. Little Yellow Woman, you never give up, do you? You must be a Navajo, yes. The narrator awakens the next morning in Silva's house. She thinks of her family, whom she imagines will report her, and she reflects on her old grandfather, who's no longer with them, but he would have loved this story, she thinks, because he loved the Yellow Woman stories. And he says, Yellow women usually come home. They almost always do. And she says to the reader, you know, there are enough of them to handle things. My mother and grandmother will raise the baby like they raised me. Al will find someone else, and they'll go on like before, except that there will be this story about the day I disappeared while I was walking along the river. She decides to return home and walks off, but ends up back at Silva's house. And when she sees the house, she remembers that she meant to go home. Quote, but that didn't seem important anymore, unquote. Silva has killed a beef cow, and he's dressing the carcass, and he asked her to go to Marquez with him to sell the meat. As they're riding toward Marquez, a fat white rancher comes up the trail and meets them and accuses Silva of rustling the cattle. And Silva tells the narrator to ride back up the mountain. He tells Yellow Woman, go back to the mountain. And she tries to go up the difficult trail. She makes it with some difficulty. She hears 4 shots and decides that Silva has shot the rancher. And instead of continuing up toward Silva's house, she rides into the valley and homeward, near the place by the river where she first encountered this man. She dismounts, starts the horse off alone on the trail she's just traveled, and then she continues on foot in the opposite direction. So she sends the horse back. She goes back toward the pueblo. But she sits for a while by the river and thinks about him before she heads to the pueblo. This is the narrator speaking to the reader. I came back to the place on the riverbank where he'd been sitting the first time I saw him. The green willow trees that he had trimmed from the branch were still lying there, wilted in the sand. I saw the leaves and I wanted to go back to him, to kiss him and to touch him. But the mountains were too far away now. And I told myself, because I believe it, he will come back sometime and will be waiting by the river. And this is the end of the story. I followed the path up from the river into the village. The sun was getting low, and I could smell supper cooking when I got to the screen door of my house. I could hear their voices inside. My mother was telling my grandmother how to fix the jello. And my husband, Al, was playing with the baby. I decided to tell them some Navajo had kidnapped me, but I was sorry that old Grandpa wasn't alive to hear my story, because it was the Yellow Woman stories he liked the best. This is a poem now in the same collection, Storyteller, that is called Storytelling. And as you can tell, it's about Yellow Woman. You should understand the way it was back then, because it is the same even now. Long ago, it happened that her husband left to hunt deer before dawn, and she got up and went to get the water. Early in the morning, she walked to the river where the sun came over the long red mesa. He was waiting for her that morning in the tamarack and willow beside the river. Buffalo man in buffalo leggings. Are you here already? Yes, he said. He was smiling, because I came for you. She looked into the shallow, clear water. But where shall I put my water jar? Upside down, right there, he told her, on the riverbank. You better have a damn good story, her husband said, about where you've been for the past 10 months and how you explain these twin baby boys. That gossip isn't true. She didn't elope. She was kidnapped by that Mexican at Siama feast. You know my daughter isn't that kind of girl. It was in the summer of 1967. TV News reported a kidnapping. 4 Laguna women and 3 Navajo men headed north along the Rio Puerco River in a red 56 Ford. And the FBI and state police were hot on their trail of wine bottles and size 42 panties hanging in the bushes and trees all along the road. We couldn't escape them, he told police later. We tried, but there were 4 of them and only 3 of us. Seems like it's always happening to me. Outside the dance hall door, late Friday night in the summertime, and those brown-eyed men from Cubero, smiling, they usually ask me, have you seen the way the stars shine up there in the sand hills? And I usually say, no. Will you show me? It was that Navajo from Alamo, the tall, good-looking one. He told me he'd kill me if I didn't go with him And then it rained so much and the roads got muddy. That's why it took me so long to get back home. My husband left after he heard the story and moved back in with his mother. It was my fault, and I don't blame him either. I could have told the story better than I did. And now I want to tell you another story. Do you remember the coyote story? Where we left that story? Bones at the bottom of the mesa. Well, Silko has another poem in the book called Skeleton Fixer. And I want you to pay attention to the first voice here. And then I want you to think about stories as we've been discussing them for 10 weeks now. What happened here? She asked. Who asked? What happened here? She asked. Some kind of accident? Words like bones. Words like bones scattered all over that place. Old Man Badger, he traveled from place to place searching for skeleton bones. There was something only he could do with them. On the smooth sand, Old Man Badger started laying out the bones. It was a great puzzle for him. He started with the toes. He loved their curve, like a new moon, like a whisker hair. Without thinking, he knew their direction, laying each toe bone to walk east. I know it must have been this way. Yes, he talked to himself as he worked. He strung the spine bones as beautiful as any shell necklace. The leg bones were running so fast that dust from the ankle joints surrounded the wind. Oh, poor dear one who left your bones here. I wonder who you are. Old Skeleton Fixer spoke to the bones, because things don't die. They fall to pieces, maybe. Get scattered or separate, but old Badger Man can tell how they once fit together. Though he didn't recognize the bones, he could not stop. He loved them anyway. He took great care with the ribs, marveling at the structure which had contained the lungs and the heart. Skeleton Fixer had never heard of such things as souls. He was certain only of bones. But where a heart once beat, there was only sand. Oh, I will find you one somewhere around here. And a yellow butterfly flew up from the grass at his feet. Ah, I know how your breath left you, like butterflies over an edge, not falling, but fluttering, their wings rainbow colors. Wherever they are, your heart will be. He worked all day. He was so careful with this one. It felt like the most special of all. Old Man Badger didn't stop until the last spine bone was arranged at the base of the tail. Amu, my dear one, these words are bones. He repeated this 4 times. Pa, 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 pa. Pa, 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 pa. Pa, 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 pa. Pa, 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 pa. An old coyote woman jumped up and took off running. She never even said thanks. Skeleton Fixer shook his head slowly. It's surprising sometimes, he said, how these things turn out. But he has never stopped fixing these poor scattered bones he finds. This is a piece of a bigger story they tell around Laguna and Acoma too. Do you see what that poem's about? Silko is the skeleton fixer. She's taken these old stories of Konichi Nako, of Yellow Woman, that frankly exist only in, or for a while existed only in museums, gathered by the early 20th century anthropologists Franz Boas and Elsie Clues Parsons, and they were dead. They were just dead, as everything in a museum is dead. She became skeleton fixer. She's the voice at the beginning. Words like bones. Let me see what I can do. And what we got was this. And this, as you can probably tell already, is basically a scrapbook of her life and her people's lives, with photographs and stories and poems and just things she overheard her grandmother and aunt say. Skeleton fixer. The stories live. Thank you. All right. I love, love, love that story. So much to think about here. Crossing the river. It's a woman who's the hero in this story. The leaving of the domestic life for the sacred. Once again, the sacred is not typically found in the domestic, at least in these stories. But she goes back, so there's the return, right? Well, it's directed toward the world, but that's a good question. Silko is actually criticized by a fellow Laguna writer named Paula Gunn Allen for revealing a clan story in ceremony. So these stories have been protected and handed down. Some stories were told to Elsie Clues Parsons, and they were recorded in the Bureau of American Ethnology, these yellowed sepia tomes where the stories are just laid out there and they're just lying there, not doing anything. Silko considered it her mission in her search for justice to retell these stories in print in a different medium and for a different time and place. So everything she does is to the world, but she's using the localized stories of her people. Again, this is something we've talked about the whole time, is what Campbell called ethnic ideas, the particular story in place, and then what you get from it, the universal notions. That make sense? Yeah. So, it's a story ultimately for all of us about the power of the search, about the power of women who undertake the search, about the power of women who will cross the river. And once they do, the men kind of become out. We're just looking for another woman to hang out with, someone to help with the baby. But she's the one who ventures into the mountains with the dangerous Katsina spirit. And sometimes Yellow Woman does not return. She disappears into the mountains. And if the story is not acted out, it's not alive. So Silko talks about growing up in Laguna and wandering down by the river as a teenage girl and expecting to see Whirlwind Man, because why wouldn't she? That's the story she knows, and she's down by the river, and so the story becomes enacted. But I see what you're getting at. There's a multiplicity of stories in Laguna. So there's a multiplicity of Yellow Woman stories, and she does different things, and in some stories she's part of this particular clan that's especially violent. In other stories she's more of a not passive, but she's more of a classical heroine as we would know her. The point is multiplicity. So there are not analogous stories for men, but there are stories for men. And you know who they usually are? They're the twin boys, right? So this is an old pattern in world mythology, especially in indigenous mythology, is that a woman takes the leap into the unknown, which turns out to be the sacred. She is impregnated there, and she returns with twins. The twins are what bring culture to the people. I don't know if you remember a story I told you a long time ago about the woman who fell from the sky. No, it's an Iroquoian story. Do you want to hear it again? Yeah, I guess I kind of have to now, don't but it's right in line with what Sarah's talking about. So it turns out there was a great magician who lived in this town, and he was very powerful. And there was a family there who had a daughter who had come of age. And they said, it's time for you to be married. And the magician had taken a fancy to her, and he said, I'd like for this woman to be my wife. And they said, well, I don't know if she should be the wife of a magician. And he said, well, you have a good point. I am a magician. I am pretty awesome. Let's put her through some tests. Right? We know this story, right? How many tests are there? There are always 3 tests. Except with Psyche, there's kind of a 4th one, but that's okay. So yes, she goes through these 3 tests, and they're oddly similar to Psyche's tests, by the way. Or maybe Psyche's is similar to this one. She has to separate, she has to husk corn, boil it. She has to boil it naked so that the corn pops out on her and the mush burns her. And it's tons and tons of corn. And then in the very end, the magician calls his wild beasts in, these mountain lions and pumas and such. And they lick the mush off her naked body. And of course, with each lick creates a wound. And she stands and takes it. We might say she persists. And he said he's impressed. And he's the magician. He's like, all right, you know what? I think maybe you are worthy of being my wife. I will take you as my wife. Well, being the wife of a magician is a fairly boring thing, apparently, because the magician's just magicianing. So what do? Turns out outside their place their hogan was a tree, and it was a pretty amazing tree. And so the woman ended up spending a lot of time under this tree. It was incredible. It's like had these leaves that caught the light and refracted it, and when the breeze blew, there was a sound, almost like voices coming from the tree, a beautiful chorus of voices. And she just spent her days out there under that tree. Meanwhile, the magician is talking with the village council, and it turns out it's been a long time since it's rained. And this is life and death, of course, in an agricultural society if it doesn't rain. And so they're having this council, and they're trying to figure out what went wrong and why the gods are displeased or why it hasn't rained. And so they're backtracking through all that's happened, and one of the council members says, bravely or perhaps stupidly, to the magician, we were fine until you married that woman. That's when the drought came. And he gets upset, and he's like, I love this woman. She passed my test. Are you crazy? I resent this. But you're right. You're right. That's when the drought came. And so this goes on for a while, and they finally wear him down and convince him that he must kill his wife. So he's like, well, how am I supposed to do this? Which is kind of funny in the story because he's a magician, but okay. As I always say, it's not the logical, it's the mythological. And they said, well, she loves that tree. So he said, okay. And they said, just pull up the tree, throw her in the hole, put the tree back. Dude, this is easy. He's like, all right, I guess. And so he procrastinates. He doesn't want to do this. Meanwhile, while the council was deliberating, she had been under that tree again. She got this sense, this intuition, this notion, as women sometimes do. She lay back, spread her legs, and a blossom from the tree landed on her vagina. She knew immediately she was pregnant. So she's out by the tree another day, sure enough, and here comes the magician, kind of sheepishly for a magician. And he says, what do you think's underneath that tree? She's like, underneath it? Dude, you should know what's on it. No, she doesn't say that. She says, I don't know what's underneath the tree. Why would I even ask such a question? He's like, well, I think maybe we should explore what's underneath the tree. This sounds like a couple's conversation. Yeah, we should explore that. And she's like, all right, whatever you want, right? So he pulls up the tree and he expects to see the hole. He's going to kick her in, put the tree back. Instead, what he sees is an incredible expanse of blue. And even he's taken aback, and she's really shocked, and they're like, well, that's unusual. And what is that? And she says, I don't know. And he says, I don't know either. And he's like, maybe one of us should find out. And she's like, what do you mean? And he says, maybe one of us should jump into the hole and see what's down there. And she says, all right, I'll do it. And she does. And that's the woman who fell from the sky. She's the mother of us all. And she's pregnant with the culture twins. She's pregnant with the twin boys that bring the Iroquois everything they need to know to live. So there's another story. I love that story. Yeah. Joy Harjo, another poet, Native American poet, Muskogee Creek. She's also a saxophone player, and she has a band called Poetic Justice. She wrote a book of poetry called The Woman Who Fell from the Sky. This is a really important story. I always tell my students when I share that story, I say, imagine if your life was guided by that story instead of the Genesis story. Now, I'm not talking about you have this romantic notion of the woman who fell from the sky, isn't that sweet, that's lovely. I'm talking about that's your story. That is your story. That's what you believe. That's how you orient yourself in the world. First of all, you'd treat trees very differently, wouldn't you? And secondly, you'd treat women very differently, wouldn't you? The woman who fell from the sky.